This is Duke University.
Okay, let's fire away. Okay, 1, 2, 3.
A lot of the Republican pundits after the election said that they felt like McCain wasn't a strong candidate, didn't want to
Romney.
Yeah. Romney, I'm sorry. And they felt that both McCain and Romney were basically too moderate in the general election. Is there any data or evidence that you would have that possibly a more conservative candidate would have done better in the general election?
There is absolutely none. And the fact of the matter is, for all the hubbub every 4 years, for all of the noise that you hear, with the exception of Ronald Reagan, who positioned himself to the right, because he was conservative, but positioned himself to the right against several leading moderates. Every other Republican nominee has been a moderate, including Bush's, who won the presidency. And so ultimately that's what wins them. A pure conservative, there's no way to get there. The math just doesn't hold up. Bush in 2004 leaned that way to the right. However, in the process, he lost some voters who had identified themselves as Republican, but who ultimately voted for him to vote against the liberal John Kerry. But for the most part, the math just doesn't add up. Republicans need some kind of centrist wing to be a Big Tent party. Now, there was a question here.
Yeah.
Yes. 2, and then 3, and then 4.
Okay, back in 2008 when you wrote your book, you mentioned the importance of micro precincts and polling people who shop at certain places or prefer certain ethnic comedians. Have you continued to look into these micro precincts, and what do you think the importance of them will be moving forward now that 4 years have passed since?
They'll be very important in terms of micro-targeting. So, for example, when I saw the post-election results and I saw that among NASCAR fans, who are 27% of those who turned out to vote, Obama and Romney tied. That is really something. They voted for a black dude, you know? I mean, that's really something. But they were voting against Romney. He did not connect. Okay, that's one example.
The owners.
What's that?
He knew some of the owners.
He knew some of the owners, right. There was the investor class. Now, Romney won among the investor class. The problem is that at one point in time, the self-identified investor class were 45% of the electorate. They were 27% of the electorate. Now, that doesn't mean that that's how many investors we have. That means this is pure self-identification. You consider, you may still have a portfolio, what's ever left of it, you know, but you don't identify yourself that way. Those are just two of the phenomenon. So no, absolutely, there are micro precincts. Now, what are some others? You know, gun owners as well. Those tilted Romney, but you see the Democrat, everybody's pro-gun. That's just one of those things, even with the disastrous shootings that we've had. This is one of those values that is very high intense. Local sports fans, tilted conservative, but Obama got 47%. That's unheard of. And again, that's kind of a populist sort of audience. Friday Night Lights for Obama. Yes?
Yeah, I had 2 questions. The first one is, one of the coalitions that the media has mentioned in the aftermath of the election that I didn't hear you mention, in terms of one of the coalitions that was strong in the Obama camp, single white females of any age. Do you agree with that?
I do, absolutely. Let me tell you the story there, if I could. Single white females, otherwise known as SWF. In search of, no. This was an issue where about 10, 11% were undecided. And we saw Obama's numbers shoot up during the primaries when the issue of the Catholic Church, Obamacare, contraception raised its head. In fact, we saw Obama's numbers go up among married women, which generally tilt conservative. At one point, he was leading among them. He was not able to sustain that lead. And so for young women, the battleground was going to be jobs on one hand, privacy, personal reproductive rights on the other hand. In the final analysis, I was saying 2 weeks before the election, you watch Obama, and if Obama is standing in front of a crowd of young women, he wins the presidency. If Romney is going to rallies and you see Bibles in the front seat and Jesus bobbleheads on the, why would I even say that? I'm sorry. The Jesus statues on the, I'm speaking metaphorically. Then Romney is going to do well. Well, you did see young women. Ultimately, young women did come out to vote in the same numbers that they did in 2008, and Obama got 70% of young women. That was enough. Pre-election, it was 60%. So they came out to vote. Now, that was 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5.
Mine goes back to the first one, that were too moderate there. But didn't after the primary in the last few weeks, when he did go over to the center, he did much better?
He did, absolutely.
Much closer.
He did, absolutely. And that was the essence of the first debate. We emphasized how poor the Obama performance was, but the real nuts and bolts of that first debate was that there was no GOP candidate until that night. Remember, he came out of the conventions, didn't get a bounce from his own, and then after the Democratic convention, he was just slaughtered, and then he was in a free fall, the 47%, and I should have been born a Mexican. I would have had a better chance. Yikes. But that night, America got their GOP candidate, and he was in equilibrium, and he modulated his views. But in the final analysis, two things. Three things. One was Sandy. The president got to look presidential, which is something a former governor can't do. And Chris Christie launched one of the great disses in American election history. I call it, forgive me for the repetition, he engaged in our motto, e pluribus denaro. The guy with the checkbook landed in the helicopter, but he went a little bit too far.
Then he got a call from Bruce.
That didn't hurt either. The second thing was that Benghazi fizzled right out. You notice it wasn't even brought up in the third debate because the polling showed it just wasn't going anywhere. And the final thing was the unemployment rate. I'll tell you a little polling story real quick. When the unemployment was 9.3%, we asked, who would you vote for? Obama or the Republican? Because there wasn't a nominee yet. And it was the Republican leading by several points. So what we did was, what if 9.2, 9.1? When it got to 8.2%, you got a plurality for Obama, 8.0% a majority, 54% for Obama. And so I'm not going to suggest that that was the only factor, but it did tell me that that downward spiral in unemployment was also very important.
Yeah. I have a question about taking your framework and overlaying over where elections are actually fought out at the state level. So if you take your four factors and apply those to the states. So which states are next to turn blue? And I have a couple of ones I threw out. Georgia, Arizona, and Texas in the not so distant future.
Those are the three.
Why not Alabama, Mississippi, where the black population is close to a third of the population there, and increasing Latino population is not as quickly as in other places, so why not?
They do elect Democrats on a local level.
Right.
In fact, they elect a lot of Democrats on a local level. It's the creative class. Big factor, creative class. And see, of the, when I mentioned those very three states, Arizona's an easy one to capture, you know. In fact, that's been a burgeoning blue for a while. And Georgia, you know, just Atlanta, the Atlanta area itself, you know, 4.5 million people or so. People are kind of puzzled by Texas, but today the Hispanic population of Texas is 37% and growing. But it's the Austin, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio. So when we talk growth in the economy, we're talking almost exclusively creative class growth. And with that, then like North Carolina, you're getting people then from all over the world, and you're getting people from all over the United States coming in. So it's a newer, fresher thing, which you're not getting so much in Alabama and Mississippi.
So Republicans really have nowhere to play. If that, if that is true in Alabama, Georgia, and Arizona, just take those two, leave Texas aside.
Well, let me go to my colleagues for a minute at Gallup. Remember when they had their famous poll showing Obama leading by 6? Well, when you disaggregated that poll, Obama was leading substantially in 3 regions of the country, but he was down 22% in the South. So that poll was wrong, but it was interesting in its wrongness. And so now the Republican Party, to a great degree, becomes a regional party. Pockets of the Southeast, and then, of course, Idaho and Utah. Yes, and then you.
I was just wondering, it seemed that we were talking about the demographic elections. I was wondering what you thought the role was. Did the voters focus more on social issues like abortion or gay rights as opposed to fiscal issues? Was that sort of a determining factor in how different minorities voted?
Really interesting, very interesting question. You know,
What was the question?
yeah, did the voters focus on social issues or more on fiscal and economic issues? You know, James Carville is a friend. But one of the most wrong things he ever said was the only thing he's ever quoted for. It's the economy's stupid. It's here in my heart. And what ultimately gets put together that impacts my heart. And essentially, well, the economy is a value. I gotta put food on the table, right? I've gotta sustain work and income and so on. But then ultimately it becomes an issue of trust. And which candidate, and how many times do you hear voters citing a white paper or a specific detailed stance on an issue? It is, and in college professors included, I just don't like this guy. I just don't trust this woman from Alaska. So ultimately so what all got put in? For some voters it was clearly fiscal. But those were the voters for whom fiscal matters were going to be important. Look, we all do selective screening. And if I have already determined I do not like Barack Obama, and I think the Democratic Party is wrong, then there's nothing. And in fact, anything positive that's done is going to be spun negatively, vice versa. In the final analysis, in its most benign form, Americans just didn't think that Romney represented any change or that there was a need to change. In the most negative form, they just couldn't bond with Mitt Romney. He never emerged as more than the not Barack Obama.
What's unique about Iowa that makes it a blue state compared to, say, Nebraska or Kansas?
Combination of things, populist tradition, and a populist tradition that includes a strong anti-war tradition as well. Yeah, Iowa is one of those old isolationist states. You know, Wisconsin is another. But then add to that the huge impact of Ames and Iowa City, the large universities there, and the spin-offs that are happening. At the same time, you have conservative farmers who are receiving the largesse of the federal government. And so that's one of those big holes in the GOP argument in Iowa, which is cut, 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 accept. But, yeah, no, Iowa has a very strong anti-war tradition. Yes?
Was there a backlash to the voter IDs and manipulating the vote and the threat that at least the CNN and MSNBC were just appalled with the Republicans' attempt to limit the vote? How was that? How did the electorate respond to that, or was it just, brushed off?
No. The electorate responded. First of all, there were legal cases that struck voter ID down in some key states, which sort of made it lose its momentum. But then secondly, there was real substantial organization of get out the vote among minority communities that in particular would have been discriminated against. There was a cognizance of it. These things go on anyway. The flyers, that say, because of huge traffic on Tuesday in this neighborhood, the election is postponed until Thursday. Orange cones in selective neighborhoods, that just happens on a regular basis. But this time, Obama and the Democrats were prepared for it, and it was an issue that fired up high intensity. You're telling us? Well, we'll show you. And then you saw that in the early voting, for God's sakes, minorities coming out in huge numbers. Yes?
Yes, I have a question getting back to American Muslims just for a sec. What does the GOP have to do to win over American Muslims, and is there a reason for them to even make any efforts in this direction at all? Seeing as they're a small percentage, and is it strategic for them?
Well, a small percentage, but Muslims are strategically located.
Right.
And all of these states are close. And so if you look, 1% looms very large. Mm-hmm. Especially if that 1% is going to be 85%. That's the whole point in a state, With that said, there are conservative values. There are small business people. There are plenty of reasons why. Same with Latinos as well. I think in particular the problem with Muslims is that even though when we ask what are the number one issues, they really mirror the number one issues of all groups. It's very mainstream, except foreign policy. Except foreign policy. And that's what's different. Whether it's African American Muslims or a very large number of South Asian Muslims, these are groups that have a real problem with America as empire. These are groups that have a real problem with Israel, to be very blunt. And these are groups that, together with, and this is another problem that the GOP faces, is that, when we ask foreign policy questions, voters who are 50 and older, and then in particular those 65 and older, are those that subscribe to American exceptionalism. We're the vital nation. We're the superpower. American self-interest trumps all. When you get 50 and younger, you have two distinct groups. You have first globals. I've already described them. None of you guys remember David Ben-Gurion. You know, you don't remember the original. But there's also the group that was born, everybody calls Generation X. I call them Nikes. 1964, 1977. These are people who are not wedded to really any basic institution because they were born and developed into a world where everything was falling apart. So they've been on their own. And essentially they're very libertarian, including when it comes to foreign policy. They have a higher percentage that support libertarianism than young people do. Young people do.
Can I ask your thoughts on the new kind of group of polling statisticians, Nate Silver and that kind of group, what you think of them, their kind of rise in politics?
Interesting, you know, but they don't poll. You know, they play poker. And we supply the information. I'm all for anybody who takes the numbers and points the directions, because frankly, that's the whole future of work and education. You know, I'm a great believer that you students will be learning a lot less facts. Why? Because it's all going to be in a chip up here anyway. I'm not kidding. It all is. Now, how do we access it and get some meaning out of it and utilize it to make decisions? Find the stories and point in directions, solve problems. So I get that. But when Nate Silver is referred to as a pollster, he's not. A pollster is somebody who does polls, and he doesn't. But, you know, more power to him. Now, I could not do what he did. First of all, if I make a prediction, then I'm for that person. And secondly, when I've got polls that are coming in showing Romney leading by 1 point or Obama leading by 1 point, then I don't care what cattle futures say. You know, I can't come out and say, there's a 91% chance Obama's going to... No, I got to go by what I'm doing and what I see.
Do you think Silver was from one side or the other, something like that?
Yes. Yeah, he was, but, you know, I wrote a note to Nate a few years ago. Somebody said, you were being fatherly, but not a nice father. Yes, they were right. But the note to Nate was, you're one election away from mortality, like the rest of us. You know, we all get one wrong every once in a while, and he got a renewal. God bless him, but he's not a pollster, he's a poker player. Yes?
So I'd be curious if you could talk a little bit about the Catholic vote and how it played in this election around class and gender issues, because it seems to me like they've been pretty reliable sort of social justice, economic working class voters, and the hierarchy is kind of trying to get in bed with the Republicans. And it's very interesting to me how that's splitting, and if those votes hold together as a Catholic vote at all, or if it's kind of like an angry white man and a gender vote, or a Hispanic, Latino vote. Is there a Catholic vote?
There's about 12 questions there. So yeah.
Maybe that's because
No, there is not a Catholic vote. There are Catholics who vote. There are Catholic sensibilities. Yes. You get two drunk guys in a bar who haven't been to Mass in 40 years, and somebody comes in and insults the Pope. They're ready to go. But there isn't a Catholic vote. There are very few voters wake up in the morning and says, oh, I wonder what Bishop Monahan is telling me to do it today. That doesn't happen. And in fact, that Irish brogue, they sure as hell don't do that in Ireland either, as you know. There's been a huge disconnect between the hierarchy and the faithful on these issues. A conservative's a conservative. So if somebody supports the war in Iraq, they're more than likely to be supporting life. They're not listening to any differentiation here that emanates from church hierarchy. So now, with all that said, is it a barometer worth looking at? Oh, sure. Bill Clinton won in 1996, won the Catholic vote by 10 points. Al Gore won it by 6 points. That was enough to make the election a lot closer. John Kerry won it by 4 points, enough to tilt. Barack Obama won it last time, and this time it was 50 to 48, Obama. But all of that was irrelevant to the bishop's stand on issues. Those were personal choices that American Catholics made. 98%.
But why do you then talk about an evangelical vote and Muslim vote?
Because that's, an evangelical vote is different in that there are voters who vote as evangelicals. There is a Jewish vote. There are voters who vote as Jews and reliably Democrat. And what happened on election day was especially what polls said, that Barack Obama was going to lose some Jewish voters, which he did. Instead of the usual 74 or 75%, he got 69%. So he did. And it made it closer in Florida, although Florida is always just very, very close. A Muslim vote is normally was not a bullet vote, but it's become a bullet vote because of the issues that I mentioned. But there wasn't anything among Catholics. Now, what's interesting may be white Catholics, who are a shrinking portion, as Hispanic Catholics, are now 21 or 22% of the total. But Hispanic Catholics are going to vote as Hispanics.
So there's no opening for the Republicans with Hispanics in terms of Catholic aspect?
Boy, it's hard to see. Hispanics are pro-life. Republicans probably have a better shot at Hispanic evangelicals, who are now a little more than a fourth of total Hispanics. But Hispanic Catholics, are by and large going to vote Democrat. But one thing, number one on the agenda after the fiscal cliff is immigration reform. And Republicans better lead it if they want to survive. Yes, I'm sorry.
How much damage to Romney were the statements about rape by Akins and Murdoch? And you assess those as were they damaging or not?
Well, not to him personally. Obviously, it lost the Senate races, but in the final analysis, 70% of young single women, that was a statement. And there was a gender gap. Bigger gender gap than pre-election polls were showing there would be. So, yeah, one would have to conclude. I don't think that he, in any way personally got tarred and feathered by it, though it was not, there were no profiles of courage on that one. Yes?
On the fiscal cliff, do you think the Republican or the Tea Party and the really conservative Republicans are hearing a message in the election or not? Because Obama's basically coming out saying, I have a mandate to raise taxes, and then the Tea Party saying, or several Republicans saying, I haven't seen any mandate in this election.
Post-election, there are three separate parts to my answer. Post-election survey that we did, we asked, and I have the actual wording, but not in front of me, but what should Congress do now that Obama has won? And the gist of it was cooperate, seek consensus, compromise, work together, come up with consensus-built solutions, or hold on steadfastly to principle. and cooperate only when it's absolutely necessary, but otherwise, even if you need to prevent legislation from coming before, do that. 61 to 28 voted cooperation, but 47% of Tea Party supporters did. So that's one piece of the answer. Second piece of the answer is the decline in support for the Tea Party. So that it was 27% of the electorate it's 26% actually, in the electorate that voted. That in itself was very intriguing because it had been higher than that. And the third piece of it is the problem that the Tea Party faces, which is they lost 18 one-term congressmen in this election. And now, as they go into 2014, they have a real dilemma. Do they go to voters and say, I refuse to sit down with the devil, and I got absolutely nothing done for you, re-elect me? Or do they come back and say, I did sit down with the devil, vote for me, I got something done? That's a dilemma.
So one more question, and then I get to finalize it. Oh, well, I definitely want to.
You asked one, so I'm gonna do two. One, two.
Okay, so how do you think, in major sort of states like Florida, how do you think polling can be improved? Because with the past few elections, there's been a lot of issues regarding.
You mean actual conducting of polls?
Yeah.
Or the polling where people vote?
Both.
Okay. In terms of polling, frankly, I'm going to defend the whole industry, everybody. I thought we all did extremely well, including Florida. And Florida was close. Most of us had it close. There were a few that were off points here and there. Better turnout models, something that we try to pay very close attention to. But I will tell you, this is a much broader answer. I'll summarize it. The future polling is where we are, which is the internet. The landline telephone, landline penetration today is where it was in 1963. And we can't call cell phones. Some states have legal prohibitions, and you can't reach people on cell phones, and when you do, we don't have one question, we have 40 to ask. You can't, not for very long, anyway. So, internet, and that's getting better and better and better. In terms of how people vote, I think that I worry about die-vote machines, about any of that stuff. I got a guy who works for me, a young man who's wonderful. He's been with me for 12 years, but one of these days he's going to launch a drone from his home out in the country, That sort of stuff scares me. You know what I'm talking about? There's these kids that can do that sort of thing. The old machines with the lever? Bring them back, for God's sakes. There was nothing magical about them at all. Yes?
After the votes were counted, were you surprised that Romney got 2 million fewer votes than McCain, despite the supposed anti-Obama vote that was out there going?
Not in the final analysis, no. I think a lot of the wind was knocked out of the sails. Number one, national security was not the issue. Benghazi was not the issue. Unemployment didn't turn out to be the issue. Just who is Mitt Romney? And that was a very important issue. And there was a fourth one, but I can't remember. But no, I guess I wasn't surprised. When all is said and done, I think we're going to find out that almost as many total voters voted this year that voted in 2008. And that's with an incumbent president who wasn't terribly popular. And a recession. Ending public perception. Very last.
Do you foresee a possible moderation of the two-party system in the future?
You mean of the Tea Party movement?
Two parties.
There'll be two parties. I'm just not sure which they'll be. But yeah, we've had these in American history. They don't come up very often, but they've come up 3 or 4 times now where we've had big demographic shifts and a transformation a readjustment of the two parties, yes, there will be. There will be a centrist party. There will be. There has to be a second big tent party. And the elements are always there. It just is the right tipping point moment. And
I do get the last question. So go ahead. Do I get one last one?
Yes,
On
you
behalf of the...
No, you're the boss.
Okay, great. So you talked about these key demographics, Latino and African Americans, young people in creative class. And these demographics are growing as voters. Do you think that this will continue into 2016? I know it's far away, but do you think that they will stay Democrat and vote that way?
Barring anything unforeseen, probably. Latinos, yes. African Americans, always. Young people, let's look at where libertarianism takes them, and then let's look at the number of gigs that are on the table. Creative class grows, and creative class is an area where Republicans have potential, especially when it comes to local and regional economic development efforts. But the party has got to cool its jets, when it comes to contraception and issues like that. That's one of the questions I get. Where did that one come from? Nobody talks about that. And certainly not old white guys.
Sorry, so I just want to end on this, and especially for the focus cluster on the Middle Eastern context and global context, and building on what you said, getting back to the Muslim vote. And one of the things you said was, the one issue that defines the Muslim vote, if there is one, is foreign policy. But in thinking about what you're talking about, the first globals, increasingly Muslims are made up of U.S. born, and their disenchantment with policy on the home front, both towards Muslims and economic policy. So where do you see that fitting into the demographic? I mean, we call the Muslim vote, but is there such a thing, or will there be one?
There will be a Muslim influence vote. So, for example, in 2005 and 6, I was hired by various branches of the military to do focus groups among Muslim Americans, in particular Arab Americans. They're looking for Arabic speakers, and especially in combat. And it was very interesting because it was 2005. Because on one end, there were young people who said, yes, I'll go into combat, but not to kill, but to help. I mean, if I can prevent an accidental death, simply because I've got a unique skill, they can say, whoa, wait, I'll consider that. So that was one part of the answer. Then Abu Ghraib broke. And honest to God, I couldn't even finish scheduling focus groups. I couldn't get anybody to go. We were paying $300. That ain't bad, plus a sandwich. What does that tell you?
Well, please join me in thanking John.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.